This video contains sensitive content related to complex relational dynamics and self-inflicted harm. Viewer discretion is advised.
She spent 20 years living in a house where every routine looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. 2 careers, 2 incomes, a mortgage paid on time, and a schedule that never seemed to break down. But beneath that quiet precision, something else was happening. Something so subtle that she didn't fully see it until the structure around her collapsed. If you're drawn to the hidden dynamics inside relationships and the shadows that live behind everyday decisions, hit like and subscribe so we can keep exploring stories like this together. Let's begin. Alex met the man she would later call the architect on an evening that felt harmless in every sense. He was calm, meticulous, someone who measured his words before speaking. She liked that about him. It made her feel as though nothing chaotic could reach him. In the first few weeks, she noticed his fascination with systems, numbers, routines, ways to perfect the small inefficiencies of daily life. He never pushed these ideas on her, not at first. He simply presented them like possibilities. And Alex, who valued reliability, found comfort in the order he carried with him. 3 months in, he showed her a spreadsheet he designed. The rows and columns mapped out how much they could save if they combined living expenses. It wasn't emotional, just practical. Alex looked at the figures, saw the logic, and made a decision she believed was responsible. She ended the lease on her apartment. Moving in felt natural, almost easy. 6 months after that, the first details slipped from her hands without her really noticing. One of her credit card payments was late, something she rarely allowed to happen. He said he could help keep track of those deadlines so she wouldn't have to worry. It seemed efficient. He used her laptop to log into her accounts, reorganized her payment schedules, and merged the remaining balances into a joint account to simplify things. He changed the passwords for security, but he always typed them in for her if she needed to access anything. It felt like a small favor, something temporary. Her friendships shifted more gradually. After dinners with her friends, he sometimes mentioned something subtle he'd observed, how someone had interrupted her mid-sentence, or dismissed one of her ideas too quickly, or seemed to drain her energy. He always said it gently, almost protectively. Alex didn't cut anyone off, she just stopped reaching out as often. And eventually, the invitations slowed until they disappeared.
The house seemed to run on a rhythm he set, without ever announcing it. Bills were paid before she even remembered they were due. Repairs appeared handled the same day they surfaced. Deliveries arrived on a schedule she never saw him write down. Nothing was chaotic because he removed the possibility before she noticed it. And that efficiency created a kind of quiet that felt reassuring, almost too reassuring. Everything simply functioned. And in a house where everything always ran smoothly, it became easier not to ask how. But cracks in any system begin quietly. He started directing portions of their income toward outside ventures, investments he monitored alone. Alex learned about them only because she intercepted a statement he usually handled before it reached the mailbox. She asked a simple question, why the balance was lower. His response wasn't anger, it was a quiet look, the same measured tone as always, asking why she doubted decisions that had kept their life stable for years. The conversation ended soon after, and she let the matter drop. The ventures failed, their savings vanished, and when he finally told her, he didn't apologize. Instead, he walked her through a list of external forces that had worked against him. She listened. The house stayed calm. But something inside Alex shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, deliberate recalibration. She reached out to an acquaintance he'd never discouraged. She created a hidden digital file where she gathered documents, notes, pieces of information she hadn't organized in years. Each step was small, almost invisible. And yet, he noticed. One Tuesday afternoon, after months of tension neither of them named aloud, he he left a short note on the kitchen counter, walked into the garage, and ended his life.
The police arrived before sunset. The house fell silent in a way it never had before. Alex was left standing inside the structure he had created, holding the keys, the empty accounts, and a quiet she couldn't yet decipher. In the days that followed, Alex moved through the house as though it belonged to someone else. The routines that had once given the place its steady rhythm were suddenly broken. The envelope on the counter stayed empty. The blinds remained half closed because no one adjusted them at dawn. She had lived in calm for so long that quiet felt normal, but what felt unfamiliar was the absence of expectation. There was no one evaluating her movements, no one tracking the rhythm of her day, no one waiting for her to speak or asking why she had done something a certain way. For the first time in 2 decades, the space around her didn't respond to her. It simply existed. In that stillness, she tried to understand how everything had unfolded. Now, looking at the house through a different lens, she saw patterns she hadn't noticed before. The way certain decisions had slowly slipped from her hands, the way her world had narrowed without feeling restricted. The habits had formed without ever being discussed. When she met with the investigators and financial officers, she learned details she had never been given access to. The investments were larger than she imagined. The accounts were structured in ways that didn't reflect the conversations she remembered. Agreements she believed were temporary had been formalized. The hardest part wasn't the paperwork, it was the doubts that surfaced late at night, the ones that asked whether she had missed warnings that were obvious to others. They came with the weight of 2 decades lived inside someone else's system. As she sat in the living room one evening, surrounded by boxes she had begun to pack, she recognized something she hadn't allowed herself to admit out loud. The house had never truly been hers, not the way she imagined, not the way she believed a shared life should feel. She had lived inside a design she trusted without questioning because it felt stable, predictable, safe. More sharply than ever before, she began to understand that her story wasn't defined by the final moment in the garage. The meaning was buried in the structure, the gradual, patient construction of a system that looked supportive, functional, reliable, until the day it wasn't.
If we want to understand what truly happened inside that house, we must shift from the events themselves to the mechanisms that shaped them. Because the shadows in this kind of story don't appear suddenly. They form over time, behind routines that look harmless, inside decisions that feel reasonable, and beneath dynamics that are easy to dismiss when life seems peaceful. It's only when the quiet breaks that the blueprint becomes visible. When we look at a story like Alex's, the temptation is to focus exclusively on the final chapter, the dramatic moment that seems to define everything. But the real insight doesn't come from the last event, it comes from the slow, almost invisible pattern that shaped the entire relationship. What happened in that house over 20 years follows a structure that appears in many relationships where control operates quietly, and understanding that structure is what allows us to see the darker mechanics beneath the surface. The first mechanism is the gradual shrinking of someone's world. It rarely begins with a demand or a confrontation. It usually starts with subtle suggestions framed as concern or practicality. A comment about how a friend treated you, a quiet remark about how much energy social interactions seem to drain, a small decision made on your behalf that feels helpful. None of these moments register as threats, they feel like support. But over time, they change the landscape of a person's life until they no longer have external points of reference. When you lose those reference points, you begin to rely on the closest voice, the one that remains inside your daily routine. The second mechanism is the transfer of functional power. Not emotional power, not yet, but the small everyday capacities that make a person independent. Access to money, access to information, access to the things you need to make decisions without permission. The shift can appear justified for a long time, especially when one partner seems better at organizing, planning, or managing practical matters. But when those responsibilities become centralized in one person's hands, the ability to act freely becomes limited, and limitations, when repeated long enough, turn into conditions. The third mechanism is emotional unpredictability, even if it never looks like conflict. Sometimes it's silence instead of anger, avoidance instead of argument, withdrawal instead of explanation. These moments create tension that the other partner tries to resolve, often by complying more, questioning less, or minimizing their own needs. And when that tension is later relieved through affection, attention, or a return to calm, it reinforces the idea that peace comes from alignment rather than autonomy.
A final element appears sometimes in systems like this. When a structure of dependency starts to fracture, the person who built it may attempt one last move to preserve the story in which they held power. In this case, the architect's final choice did not simply end things for him, it reshaped the emotional terrain Alex would have to navigate. The suddenness, the silence, the unanswered questions, everything collapses onto the one left standing. Instead of stepping into freedom, Alex is forced to carry the weight of a moment she didn't choose, a moment that eclipses 2 decades of subtle erosion. This is how control sometimes lingers long after the person is gone, not through intention we can definitively name, but through the emotional aftermath that anchors the survivor to a narrative of guilt, responsibility, and unfinished meaning. Individually, each of these dynamics can appear benign, but together, over years, they form a pattern that's difficult to detect from the inside because nothing seems extreme. Instead, everything feels gradual, reasonable, or even caring. That's what makes these structures so effective. They are built slowly, with the cooperation of the person living inside them. The reason this story matters is that these dynamics do not appear suddenly. They are engineered slowly. For those who recognize traces in their own lives, there are a few practical steps that can shift the balance toward autonomy without creating unnecessary confrontation. The first is to quietly rebuild a private base of resources. That doesn't always mean money. It can also mean access to your own documents, your own accounts, your own channels of communication. The goal is to have at least one domain of your life that functions independently of anyone else's oversight. The second is to limit the emotional fuel that keeps the controlling dynamic alive. When you reduce reactive responses, whether defensive, apologetic, or explanatory, you lower the intensity of the interaction. Responding with calm, minimal, factual statements creates a protective distance. It's not about winning an argument, it's about not offering the energy that keeps the cycle active. The third step is to bring an external observer into the picture. This doesn't need to be a confession or an emotional disclosure. It can be a conversation with a professional, a legal advisor, or even someone trustworthy outside your daily environment. A single informed perspective can restore the reference points that isolation has eroded. It can also clarify which parts of your situation are practical issues and which parts are structural. In Alex's case, the ending was irreversible, but the story doesn't hold value because of the final memento. It holds value because of what it reveals about the architecture of subtle control. If you recognized something familiar in this story, or if you want to explore more hidden dynamics behind everyday behavior, leave a comment below. And if stories like this help you see the shadows more clearly, make sure to subscribe and watch the next video.